Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story of love, family, and tough choices. What happens when a man has to choose between his family's expectations and the woman he loves? Will his decision tear them apart or bring them closer? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any future videos. Things had started to settle. For the first time in what felt like forever, the CEO felt like he could breathe again. After the long, drawn-out tension with his family, the agreement with his father had finally come through. The decision wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy. But it was a start. The first steps toward building a life together, without constant interference. Tieu Lac sat by the window of their apartment, looking out at the city below. The sounds of the bustling streets below seemed distant here, as if she and the baby were in their own little world, separate from everything else. She watched as the CEO walked in from the other room, his expression a little softer than usual. It had been weeks since they had moved in here, but today felt different. His face was lighter, less burdened by the weight of family expectations. He had finally made his decision, and the consequences of that decision were beginning to unfold. "Dad's coming over again," the CEO said, his voice lighter than before. "He wants to spend more time with the baby." Tieu Lac looked up, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, it didn't feel like a chore. It didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like progress. Slowly, the walls between them were coming down. "Do you think he really means it?" she asked, her voice unsure. "Do you think he really accepts us?" The CEO smiled as he sat beside her, taking the baby from her arms and cradling her gently. "I think he's trying. He's not there yet, but he's making an effort. That's all we can ask for." Tieu Lac nodded slowly, but deep down she couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of doubt. She had seen the subtle ways his mother tried to control everything. She had felt the distance from his father, despite his efforts to be more open. But today, as the CEO held their daughter, everything seemed a little clearer. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. It wasn't surprising. It had become a regular occurrence for the CEO's father to drop by, especially after he had made the decision to visit more often. There was something about spending time with the baby that seemed to soften him, something that was starting to form a connection between him and Tieu Lac. "Come in, Dad," the CEO called out as he opened the door. His father stepped in, his usual stoic demeanor softened just a little. He was holding a small gift for the baby, something that showed the subtle shift in his attitude. He had started to show interest, real interest, in his grandchild. "Here," his father said, handing the gift over, "it's a little something for her." Tieu Lac took the gift, a soft smile on her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's so thoughtful." His father nodded, his expression neutral but not dismissive. He was beginning to show that he could be more than just the controlling patriarch. He was trying to adapt to this new reality. As the visit continued, the conversation flowed a little easier than before. The CEO's father asked more about the baby, about how things had been going. It wasn't much, but it was more than Tieu Lac had ever expected from him. There was a warmth that wasn't there before, a slight shift in the way he spoke to her. "You're doing a good job with her," his father remarked as he watched Tieu Lac interact with the baby. "She seems happy." "I'm trying my best," Tieu Lac replied, her voice steady. "But it's not just me, we're doing this together." The CEO smiled at the exchange, feeling a small sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to settle. His family was beginning to accept what he had chosen. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Later that evening, as his father left, the CEO stood by the door, watching him go. He turned back to Tieu Lac, who was sitting on the couch, holding the baby in her arms. "That went better than I thought," he said, walking over to sit beside her. "I think he's starting to come around." Tieu Lac smiled, but there was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't fully convinced yet. "I hope so," she said softly. "I really do." The next day, the atmosphere in the apartment was lighter than before. There was a sense of calmness, a peace that had been missing for so long. The CEO and Tieu Lac spent the morning together, enjoying a rare moment of quiet. The baby was napping peacefully in her crib, and for once they could just be. But as the day went on, something began to shift in the air. It wasn't a change anyone could put a finger on, but it was there. As the CEO walked into the room, he saw that Tieu Lac was looking out the window again, her gaze distant. He walked over and sat down beside her, noticing the slight sadness in her eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked softly. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about my family," she said quietly. "About my parents. About home." The CEO's heart skipped a beat. He had known that this would come up eventually. She hadn't seen her family in a long time, and it was only natural that she would miss them. But hearing her say it aloud made him realize just how much she had been holding inside. "I miss them too," she continued, her voice tinged with emotion. "I want to go back and visit. It's been too long." The CEO nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know," he said softly. "But I also know that going back home will bring up some things you've been running from." She looked at him, her expression sad but accepting. "I don't know if I'm ready to face it all, but I miss them. I miss the familiarity." For a moment there was silence. The baby's soft breaths were the only sound in the room. Later that evening, as they sat down for dinner, the conversation took an unexpected turn. The CEO's father had come back to the apartment, and they were all gathered around the table. But the warmth that had filled the previous days was gone. A cold tension hung in the air. "I've been thinking," his father said, his voice measured. "Maybe it's time for you to go back home. Not just for a visit, but for good." Tieu Lac's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. "Go back home," she repeated softly. "Yes," his father replied. "I think it's time for you to reconnect with your family. There's more stability there for you. Maybe it will help clear your mind." The CEO looked at his father, his face unreadable. "What do you mean by that?" His father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Tieu Lac, his eyes cold, calculating. "You've been here long enough. Maybe it's time to think about what's best for the baby and for your future." Tension filled the room, and Tieu Lac felt her heart sink. Would her past finally catch up with her? Would she be forced to choose between her family and the life she had built with the CEO? The questions lingered as the room fell silent again, and for the first time in a while, Tieu Lac wasn't sure what the future held. The atmosphere in the apartment was suffocating, the tension thick as the words from his father hung heavily in the air. The CEO sat still, not looking at anyone in particular. His eyes were focused somewhere far away, as if searching for an answer that didn't exist. He hadn't expected this from his father, not after everything they'd been through. Tieu Lac, on the other hand, felt a weight settle in her chest. Her gaze shifted between the CEO and his father. She could feel the pressure building, the unspoken judgment, the fear of what this could mean for their future. She had hoped this visit would be a chance to reconnect, a chance for everything to finally feel normal again. But now it felt like a trap. The CEO cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. "What exactly do you mean by that?" His voice was calm, but laced with a tension that mirrored the unease in the room. "Are you suggesting we should go back to the way things were?" His father's gaze softened, but the firmness in his voice remained. "I'm not suggesting anything, son. I'm stating facts. There are things in life that are bigger than our desires, bigger than our personal happiness. Stability is one of them. I'm offering you the opportunity to get back on the right path, to rebuild your life." Tieu Lac felt her heart race. She wasn't sure how much more she could take. She had left so much behind when she chose to be with the CEO. Leaving her family had been one of the hardest decisions of her life. But now it felt as if the past was pulling her back, threatening to undo everything they had built together. "What path are you talking about?" The CEO's voice trembled slightly, a crack in his usually unwavering composure. "I'm not asking for your approval anymore, Dad. This is my life. Our life. Tieu Lac and the baby are my family now. I've made my choice." His father's eyes darkened slightly. "Choices have consequences, son. You're a grown man now, but don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. There are things you're not seeing, things you haven't fully understood yet." Tieu Lac looked down at her hands, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of her sleeve. She wanted to say something, to defend herself and her family, but she knew that this was a battle the CEO had to fight himself. And still, she couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. She could feel her past creeping in, threatening to change everything again. The silence in the room stretched longer. The CEO's father didn't say anything more, and the CEO was left staring at his lap, his thoughts racing. It wasn't that he didn't understand his father's point of view. It was that he couldn't accept it anymore. The life his father had planned for him wasn't the life he wanted. "I don't want to go back," the CEO said quietly, his voice steady now. "I'm not going back to that life. Not for the company, not for anyone." His father sighed, looking disappointed but not surprised. "You'll learn the hard way, son. Life has a way of forcing us back to where we belong." With that, the conversation seemed to end. The CEO's father stood up, his face still calm, but his eyes full of unspoken judgment. "I'll leave you two to think about it," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "But remember, you can only avoid responsibility for so long." And with that, he walked out of the apartment, leaving the CEO and Tieu Lac alone again. The CEO didn't speak for a long time after his father left. The silence between him and Tieu Lac was not comfortable, but neither was it hostile. He could feel the tension in the air, the heavy weight of everything that had been said. Tieu Lac sat on the couch, still holding their baby, her eyes focused on the small child's peaceful face. The baby's innocence seemed to make everything else fade away. For a moment, Tieu Lac allowed herself to relax, to take in the simple joy of watching her child sleep. But even as she sat there, a question lingered in the back of her mind. What now? What were they going to do? Would they have to go back to his family? Would everything they had worked for be torn apart? She turned her gaze to the CEO, who was sitting across from her, lost in his thoughts. The pain on his face was clear now. He had always been strong, had always known what to do, but now he was uncertain. "I don't know what to do, Tieu Lac," he said, his voice soft and tired. "I don't want to disappoint you, and I don't want to disappoint my family. But I can't keep living in the middle of all this." Tieu Lac walked over to him and sat beside him, placing the baby gently in the crib. She took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "You've already made your choice, and that's all that matters. We'll figure this out together. We don't need their approval. We just need each other." The CEO looked at her, his eyes full of gratitude, but also filled with doubt. "But is that enough? Can we make it work without them?" "We'll make it work," she said with quiet conviction. "We'll make our own path." The conversation seemed to settle the tension, if only temporarily. The CEO sat back, his thoughts still clouded with uncertainty, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. Later that evening, as they prepared for bed, the CEO received another call from his father. This time, his father's tone was less forceful, but still laced with that same unyielding pressure. "I'm not giving up on you," his father said on the phone, "but I need you to think this through. You can't just throw everything away." The CEO didn't know how to respond. His father's words weighed heavily on him, but he had made up his mind. He had to protect his family, even if it meant going against everything he had been raised to believe. "I've already thought it through," the CEO replied, "and I'm not turning back." He hung up the phone, his heart racing with uncertainty. He had made his decision, but the path ahead was anything but clear. As Tieu Lac lay beside him, her hand resting on his chest, she whispered softly, "We'll be okay. We'll figure it out." He pulled her close, holding her tight. "I hope so." But deep down, the question still lingered. Would their love be enough to overcome the obstacles ahead? Or would the weight of family and legacy tear them apart? As the night stretched on, they held each other, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but hopeful that together they could face anything. In today's episode, the CEO is caught between his family's expectations and his love for Tieu Lac. After gaining his father's approval to live with her and their child, things seem to be improving. But the pressure from his family is far from over. His mother's subtle control continues to loom over their lives, and the CEO must decide whether he can truly live independently or if he will always be tied to his family's influence. Meanwhile, Tieu Lac, though grateful for the progress, senses that challenges still lie ahead. As they face these obstacles together, the question remains: can their love survive the weight of family expectations, or will they be torn apart by it?